think whatever photography you do, you should always be looking to improve, and I do feel myself this year that I've definitely maybe fixed a few mistakes and definitely made some improvements in my own wildlife photography. Something I used to do was to have a tendency to underexpose too much. Now I don't entirely know why this was. It might be a little bit getting a little bit too obsessed with not blowing out the whites, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I did used to underexpose too much, and that's something I feel I've definitely improved upon this year, is just adding a little bit more exposure here and there when necessary. So this has quite often been when shooting against the water, just adding a bit of more exposure compensation, and quite commonly shooting against the sky. So if I've been shooting with aperture priority, which would be very common, an auto ISO for example, and I'm adding some exposure compensation, I'd know that I have to add a bit of plus compensation in a lot of situations against the sky, particularly when it's a bit brighter, but usually I'd kind of add a lot of the time like plus 2/3 for example, and I don't think it was really enough. So now I find I'm regularly adding +1, or in some situations maybe even +1 2/3, and I think I'm getting a much better result. I'm getting a cleaner image and just a better image all round. And it's not just the blank water or blank sky, there's even other situations where you feel the background for example might be influencing the exposure meter, and just a touch of overexposure is going to be beneficial. So even some of those situations, whereas before I'd have probably left it at 0, now I'm adding maybe just +1/3 or possibly +2/3 just to get a better exposure. I am trying to keep my shutter speed down a little bit more, and this is something I've talked about in videos. I've mentioned that you don't always need to use really fast shutter speeds, but despite me talking about that, saying it, I don't always do it myself. So I'd sometimes find myself defaulting back to a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second, or maybe even 2,000th of a second at times for a static portrait, when it just doesn't really need to be that high. With my camera, I don't want to go above a certain ISO, so there's situations where I'd prefer to try and keep the shutter speed slower so I can keep the ISO lower. And that's what I've been trying to do, particularly when I've got a really good camera support, so it's either on the tripod or maybe it's on a beanbag. And a good example of this is actually in Bulgaria recently, photographing the amazing golden orioles. We had a fantastic tour there. I'll be doing this next year and hopefully for the next few years in the future. But here the golden orioles, they were sometimes coming in very early in the morning, so even before the sun had really started to strike the perch. And I found myself here already at a very high ISO 5000, which is pretty high for my camera. I didn't really want to push the ISO any more than that, so I had to use a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second for some of the images. Now you might think that's reasonably slow for photographing birds, but with good technique and a good camera support, I was able to get absolutely pin sharp images at 1/200th, no problem. My aperture, quite a lot of the time I'd be shooting between probably f6.3 and f8 on the big lens, and that's partly to get a bit more depth of field in the subject, but also particularly with a 400mm lens, it's just often gives a little bit more sharpness and clarity if you just bring the aperture down, close the aperture down a little bit. But recently I've been just trying to embrace the wide aperture more, particularly with the 500mm lens. I've been shooting so much more at f5, f4, f5.6, and I have been shooting it wide open at f4 at times, and I've really been enjoying that. You know, it's got such a wide aperture, why not try and make the most of that at times? It does just diffuse the background so nicely, so it does give a slightly different look to if you're shooting more at f8 for example. It really just throws everything out really well. It's been very useful, particularly shooting on the water. If you're shooting on the water low down to looking towards the other side, if you're looking towards the bank, you often get that line kind of cutting through, which can be a bit of a problem, a bit distracting at times, so it certainly helps to blow that out a little bit more. That's really good. And then there's a few occasions just shooting with f4 where I've just really liked the background overall. When I photographed the red grouse recently, the crazy red grouse up in the Yorkshire Dales, I shot most of those images at f4. I think it was f4 to f5-ish, pretty much wide open, and I just love the backgrounds, the really nice diffused colours, and it's a while since I've done that, so it's been really, really enjoyable. And also in terms of insects as well, I made a video on this where I kind of asked a few questions about this, and particularly on social media, I think, and in the comments, and that was in terms of what aperture to use for insects, for insect close-ups and macro. And it's really interesting, I've actually started to like the wider apertures. So again, I'd often shoot kind of probably around f5.6 for example, just to get a bit more depth of field, but the background's fairly out of focus. But I tried some recently where shooting butterflies, and I actually went to f4 and I even went to f2.8. So shooting on the 100mm macro lens, I actually shot some of the painted lady butterflies at f2.8, and I really, really love the effect. So you're not getting that sharpness in the insect, it's very difficult to do, but I just love how it looks, and I love how soft the background is. It's maybe a little bit more creative, but it's very different. Shooting in really bright sunlight, this is something I generally hate to do. I've always been a bit of a stickler for this in terms of light, always trying to shoot, you know, within 2 or 3 hours certainly of either end of the day. I've just been trying to embrace the bright sunlight a little bit more, and maybe it's not quite as bad as I thought. I think on some days where somehow the atmosphere just seems to have a little bit more clarity, it doesn't look quite as bad. Sometimes I feel you can get reasonable results. So I've been trying to do this occasionally, mostly because I've had to, in terms of photographing particularly birds when it's been a bit bright for me. I think you have to be a little bit more careful with the angle, I find, because it's so harsh, and with shadows you need to be a little bit more careful, I think, with the angle you're approaching in terms of trying to avoid those shadows on the subject. The main subject I've been photographing in bright sunlight is in fact insects, and I've been getting some decent results. I've been photographing sometimes where the sun's been, you know, pretty high in the sky. The insects have been very active, so it's difficult to get close, but that bright sun I don't think has really been taking away too much from the image. And someone once said to me that it doesn't matter too much about the bright light for insects and macro because you're so close, you don't really get any shadows, and that always stuck with me. I think it's true with larger subjects, you're going to get shadows which they can cast on themselves, like birds' wings for example. With insects you're not really going to get that so much. I photographed this damselfly in pretty bright conditions. Generally I would much prefer the sun to be lower, but it was quite bright at this point. You just have to take what you've got sometimes, and it was performing really well, doing some really interesting poses for me and the camera. So I got in really close with the macro lens, and bright light, it's really come out nice. The colours, it's really brought out the colours pretty well, I think. Adds a little bit of a lift to the image. And also, I'm even more convinced that equipment isn't everything. Now, obviously gear is it's important to an extent, of course it is, but it doesn't necessarily need to take away from the experience that you're having. So when I went to Bulgaria earlier this year, I decided I wasn't going to take my big lens. I wanted to keep the weight down because I was there for other things as well. So I took my 400mm f5.6 lens, and I also took a 1.4 extender to add to that if I felt it was necessary. So that was how I was going to get the extra reach. Now we had some great opportunities photographing black-headed bunting from the car. That went really well. And one of the things I wanted to get was a landing shot because the black-headed bunting was coming into a perch, and I wanted to try and get a landing shot, and that meant a faster shutter speed, really fast shutter speed, and putting up the ISO. And I knew that the quality was going to suffer. So I knew with that gear that putting up the ISO to get that necessary shutter speed was definitely going to reduce the quality. But I did it anyway. I didn't have any choice. I did it anyway, and I got a couple of really, really nice shots of the black-headed bunting as it was landing. Now I know that that image would have been better with my 500mm lens. It would have been better with more expensive gear, more expensive glass. But the image is still pretty good. I don't think it, you know, the quality of it's really bad. It's up on the screen now, so you can tell me what you think. But what I'm really saying here is that looking back on it, because memories are so important when it comes to wildlife photography and any trips you have, any experiences you have with nature, I think in the past I would have probably been a bit annoyed that I hadn't made the most of the experience with the best kit I had, and maybe be a bit angry with myself and disappointed. But now I don't look at it that way. When I look back at that image, I don't feel disappointed in any way. I don't feel like what some people might think is slightly substandard equipment took away from the experience at all. The memory of this experience is the most important thing, and getting the picture is just a bonus. So I will continue to try and improve my wildlife photography this year, as I always do. I'm sure there's plenty of things I can improve upon. If any of these things have rung true with you, or there's things that you feel you've really improved on this year or that you want to improve on, let me know in the comments box below. I'll try and reply to as many comments as I can. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you somewhere in nature sometime soon.